South Sudan, a landlocked nation in East Central Africa. It is a country scarred by decades of conflict. In 2011, it finally achieved independence from Sudan. This victory came at a heavy price. Years of fighting had ravaged its infrastructure. Basic services were in shambles, the promise of a new dawn was palpable. Hope filled the air. However, a new enemy emerged: corruption. South Sudan is rich in oil, but this wealth has become a double-edged sword. Instead of benefiting the people, it has fueled corruption. Politicians and high-ranking officials have exploited this resource for personal gain. The nation's coffers have been looted, leaving the majority of its citizens impoverished. The fight for independence was meant to bring peace and prosperity, but the reality is far different. South Sudan is now one of the poorest and most corrupt countries in the world. Its people are trapped in a cycle of poverty, violence, and despair. The dream of a brighter future seems distant. Corruption in South Sudan is endemic. It has permeated every level of government. From petty bribes to grand theft, it has become a way of life. This cancer is eating away at the fabric of the nation, destroying any hope for progress. Government contracts are awarded not based on merit but on connections and kickbacks. Public funds meant for development projects are siphoned off into private accounts. The very people entrusted with serving the public are the ones exploiting them. The consequences of this rampant corruption are devastating. Hospitals lack basic medical supplies, schools crumble without teachers or books, roads are impassable, hindering trade and economic growth. The lack of basic services hits the poorest and most vulnerable the hardest. South Sudan has laws in place to combat corruption. The Southern Sudan Anti-Corruption Commission Act of 2009 and the South Sudan Penal Code Act of 2008 were meant to hold corrupt officials accountable. However, these laws have proven to be woefully inadequate. Enforcement is weak. The judiciary is plagued by interference and intimidation. Those who dare to speak out against corruption face threats and violence. Impunity reigns supreme. Bribery is a fact of life in South Sudan. It is often the only way to access even the most basic services. Citizens are forced to pay bribes to obtain healthcare, education, or even to report a crime. This extortion further entrenches poverty and inequality. Oil is South Sudan's primary source of revenue. It accounts for almost all of its exports. This resource should have been a blessing, a means to lift its people out of poverty. Instead, it has become a curse, fueling corruption and conflict. The oil sector is shrouded in secrecy. Contracts are awarded in opaque deals, revenues are siphoned off, leaving little for the public good. The oil wealth that should have been used to build schools and hospitals is lining the pockets of a corrupt few. This mismanagement of oil revenue has had a devastating impact on South Sudan's economy. It has made the country overly dependent on a single commodity, vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. This volatility hinders long-term planning and investment, further trapping the country in a cycle of poverty. Section 5. The crumbling foundations of a nation. The consequences of corruption are far-reaching. They extend beyond the financial realm and erode the very foundations of a nation. In South Sudan, corruption has undermined governance, fueled conflict, and shattered public trust. When government officials are perceived as corrupt, citizens lose faith in the system. They become disillusioned and apathetic. This lack of trust creates a fertile ground for instability and conflict. Corruption also diverts resources from essential services. This leads to a decline in the quality of education, healthcare, and infrastructure. It perpetuates poverty and inequality, creating a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. Section 6. Navigating the business labyrinth. Doing business in South Sudan is a daunting task. Corruption is a major obstacle, creating a climate of uncertainty and risk. Businesses operating in South Sudan face a myriad of challenges, from bureaucratic hurdles to demands for bribes. Dealing with land authorities and public services can be a nightmare. Permits and licenses are often delayed or denied until a bribe is paid. This extortion increases the cost of doing business, discouraging investment, and hindering economic growth. The lack of transparency and accountability creates an uneven playing field. Businesses with connections to corrupt officials are favored, while those that refuse to engage in bribery are sidelined. This unfair competition stifles innovation and entrepreneurship. Section 7. Justice delayed, justice denied. The justice system in South Sudan is weak and ineffective. It is plagued by corruption, interference, and a lack of capacity. This lack of justice has a profound impact on the lives of ordinary citizens, denying them their basic rights. The police are widely seen as corrupt. They are more likely to demand bribes than to protect citizens. Victims of crime often have little recourse, as cases are often dismissed or delayed indefinitely. The courts are also riddled with corruption. Judges are susceptible to bribery and political pressure. This lack of independence undermines the rule of law and erodes public trust in the justice system. Section 8. The price of apathy, a lost generation. The human cost of corruption is immeasurable. It robs citizens of their dignity, their hope, and their future. In South Sudan, corruption has had a particularly devastating impact on the country's youth, depriving them of education, healthcare, and opportunities. The education system is in a state of collapse. Schools lack basic supplies, teachers are often absent or unqualified, children, especially girls, are often forced to drop out of school due to poverty, conflict, or early marriage. The lack of quality education has long-term consequences. It condemns a generation of South Sudanese to a life of poverty and limited opportunities. It perpetuates the cycle of inequality and hinders the country's development. Section 9. The international community's role. The international community has a moral obligation to help South Sudan combat corruption. For too long, the country has been plagued by conflict, poverty, and bad governance. The international community must take a stand and demand accountability. International donors and organizations provide significant aid to South Sudan. They must use their leverage to pressure the government to implement reforms, strengthen institutions, and promote transparency. The international community can also play a role in capacity building. They can provide technical assistance to help South Sudan strengthen its institutions, train law enforcement officials, and promote good governance. Section 10. A beacon of hope. The power of transparency. Transparency is essential to fighting corruption. When citizens have access to information, they can hold their leaders accountable. They can demand better governance and a more equitable distribution of resources. South Sudan needs a free and independent media. Journalists must be able to investigate and report on corruption without fear of reprisal. The government must protect freedom of expression and ensure that journalists can do their job safely. Civil society organizations also play a crucial role in promoting transparency. They can monitor government spending, expose corruption, and advocate for reforms. The government must create an enabling environment for civil society to operate freely and effectively. Section 11. Towards a brighter future. The road ahead for South Sudan is long and arduous, but there is still hope. By tackling corruption head-on, South Sudan can break free from the cycle of poverty, violence, and despair. It can build a brighter future for its people. The fight against corruption requires a concerted effort from all segments of society. The government must demonstrate the political will to implement reforms, strengthen institutions, and promote accountability. Citizens must demand better governance and hold their leaders responsible. Civil society organizations must continue to play their vital role in monitoring government activities and advocating for change. And the international community must stand with the people of South Sudan in their quest for a more just and equitable society. Only then can South Sudan realize its true potential and fulfill the promise of independence.